Mr. Brad, I don't know how to give you a good introduction other than a man who is much smarter than me in the things that I know nothing about. So thank you so much for joining when it comes to the economy, the dollar, investment, all of that kind of stuff. And you had first reached out to me after the Bank of Canada well, it wasn't the first time you reached out to me, but we started this conversation after the Bank of Canada had claimed, or not the Bank of Canada, sorry, CBC had claimed that the Bank of Canada never, they didn't print anything at all. They're not printing money over there. And there's that also. And so that was a little while ago. And perhaps you can just break all of that down for us because it's confusing. And who's lying? I don't know.
Yeah, this is a really confusing topic that is obfuscated with all these really smart sounding words and terminologies. And it's been engineered this way to make us all feel like, oh, well, they must need to be Harvard educated economists in order to understand the system. We're just plebs. We don't understand this stuff and we shouldn't comment on it. And, so people out there don't need to think that you got to have some kind of degree or something to understand this stuff. It literally just is so confusing that they don't even understand it. And that's what I've kind of come to the conclusion of as I studied the history of money. And I started on my podcast having conversations with economists and central bankers, and they don't even have consensus of how much dollars there are in the world. They don't even know how to measure these things anymore. Like the system is kind of being made up as we go. And they just use all these fancy words and throw them around like quantitative easing and all this stuff to just make it seem like, okay, well, these people behind the curtain are qualified to pull these levers and set the price of money and set the quantity of money and all this stuff. And, we just have to kind of put up with it. Or really, you just kind of go blank when you start listening to it and just start scrolling or something because it's too complicated.
Do you think that's intentional?
100%. 100%.
Okay.
It's I think it's partly like the same criticism that we've seen over the last week or two since the election and leading up to the election of there's just like a low information sort of situation going on. And even though Canada is extremely well educated in terms of like secondary education, that just means like highly propagandized too, when you think about it. And it just means like we're more in debt and we believe more things we're told by figures of authority. It doesn't mean we're smarter than other countries or we can do more, we're more productive. It just means we spend a lot of our money on debt payments to get degrees and stuff. But I do think that they purposefully construct these things and create such confusing language to make us kind of like not want to dive too deep into it because it really starts to boggle the mind when you try to understand it. It's kind of insane the way the whole monetary system works.
Money and policy. There's always so many things in there that are confusing and you don't understand them. And they're these big fancy words that when you say them, like, we are going to fundamentally change the economic power and system here in Canada at lengths and levels we've never seen since the Second World War. Like, and you're like, whoa, cool.
I'm glad we elected him.
Right? Like without thinking to yourself, what is he saying? How does that make sense? What's your plan? You just instead are like, whoa, it's dumb. Anyway, continue.
Well, yeah, no, that's a good point. And it as we go, I guess maybe it's because as we get older and we live through events like COVID and stuff, you start to become more of an expert in certain areas. And you start to sort of notice every time that the media or some politician or a celebrity or something starts to talk about a topic that you're an expert in and they cover it in a way that you can see the holes and the bias. You start to question, like, what else is like that? And, that's kind of what, honestly, for me, like I said earlier, I grew up in Cape Breton in poverty and I didn't have any money. And it was a situation where nobody around me really had money. We didn't have our own houses, like we rented and stuff. My dad was a door-to-door delivery man and like he was trying to get us up into the middle class. And, my mom also was an entrepreneur, but just was not a lot of opportunities. So when you don't have that natural language of like you're striving to achieve more and to go up into the next class or whatever, you don't naturally start to think about investing and stuff like that. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, like what do you think about investing? You can't. You got to think about paying your bills. And that's
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately the situation a lot of people are in right now. And that's kind of like the thing that drove me to try to dig into the money was that. It was like I didn't want to be living paycheck to paycheck like I was when I was a kid. And as I started to first make some money as an entrepreneur, I started thinking like, well, what do I do with this money? And I built a house, my wife and I built a home, and I bought a car. And then I started researching like what go on Google here and say, what do I do with my money now? Because it was 2008, 9, 10, 11, that time when the bailouts were happening.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron Paul was running for president. And I had seen this clip of Ron Paul on the internet saying, don't steal, the government hates competition. And there was a little plaque on his desk or something like that. And I was like, oh, who's this congressperson that's like a government official that's saying this? I got to like look into this a little more. And that sent me down the rabbit hole of, okay, well, how is the money created? And what is taxes? And what if they're creating all the money to bail out all the banks and these companies that should be failing? Like, why do we pay taxes? What, can't they just print the money for the taxes? And I was like, this whole money system is a big scam. And so I didn't feel safe putting my money into stocks. I was like, I don't know. This is all a Ponzi scheme to me. It doesn't make any sense. It's not really like risk reward. It's if you're too big to fail, you get bailed out. Like, so I'm just going to invest in all the too big to fail companies. That just didn't make sense to me. So I started to understand and read more books about fiat money versus the gold standard, things like that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of these
Nope.
terms
Tell me
yet.
everything.
So, way back in 1562, the Dutch
That's the thing though,
invented.
right? Like I've definitely heard the words used, and I'll nod along and be like,
Yeah,
oh yeah, totally. But if you were to ask me, what does that mean? I'd say, I don't
I
know.
love
I
it.
just,
This
I don't actually know. It's like the toilet. Most people, if you were to say, do you know how a toilet works? You'd say, absolutely. And if you said, okay, draw a picture and show me how a toilet works, you'd say, I don't have a hot clue. So
the flushy and the plunger and the water, and then it just
the
works.
suction there, it's honestly how a toilet works is actually very fascinating. I'm very proud of our ancestors for coming up with that because it's very creative.
So, this is a great, I'm so glad that you're having me on because I just love talking about this subject. And I think it's something that affects us all. And it's one of the most
Mhm.
important things that we should all be talking about, especially in Canada, because we do not have the privilege of having the world's reserve currency like the United States does. So
Some
our
people say
dollar
that's a good
as
thing.
yeah, it is and it isn't. It is if you're on a sound money standard. If you're on a fiat money standard like we are, and we're just kind of like following the leader,
Okay,
our
so what is
dollar
a
goes down
fiat?
faster.
I'm interrupting
Yeah.
too much, but what is a
No, this
fiat
is
money
great.
standard?
Every question is valid here. And I mean, I'm the guy that was like Googling this stuff, figuring to try to figure it out 15, 20 years ago. And I'm so happy now that I can just tell people what I've learned. And, I've done like 10,000 hours of studying on all this stuff, reading lots of books and making lots of mistakes. So no dumb questions. I was there at one point. So there's basically two types of economic theory in the world. There's multiple types, really, but there's two main ones. It's kind of like how there's four parties in Canada, with the Green Party and the NDP now are not really a relevant part of the conversation. It's the Liberals and the
Mhm.
Conservatives. So in that framing, there's Keynesians and Austrians. And we are in a Keynesian system right now. And that comes from John Maynard Keynes, I believe his full name is. I may get some of this stuff a little off, by the way. I'm not an accredited person here. I'm just a longtime listener, reader, whatever. So Keynes was kind of the school of thought that in order to minimize bubbles and depressions, you need to stimulate the economy and that you need to have economic stimulus through helicopter money, basically, is what we kind of like colloquially say now, or money printing. But the idea there was that you go into debt to stimulate the economy to prevent depressions and to keep inflation at this like 1 to 2% target that you always hear them say, oh, there's a 2% target of inflation. You've
I'm
probably heard
taking
that
notes,
before,
by the
right?
way, so ignore me.
No, great. I use Valdarian beard wax, if you're wondering. Not relevant.
I thought it was at first. I was like, what? Like,
Yeah. It
yikes.
staves off inflation. So
Okay,
yeah,
what
there's
you just said there was really interesting, though. So, like, you have to go into debt, right? And
yeah.
then
So in the
stimulate.
Keynesian school, which is what all of our universities teach, it's what all of our central bankers espouse. It's what all of our kind of like modern intellectuals and journalists that are in the financial sector, like they're all Keynesians basically. And basically, a Keynesian, like I said, is it's a school of economic thought that targets inflation, and they target inflation because they want to see prices rise because they think that's good for the economy, rising prices,
Mhm.
and they do not want to see falling prices. To a Keynesian and to anybody in the current government or central bank, like falling prices means economic recession, which leads to depression, which they believe is a cascading effect that can cause something like we saw in the Great Depression.
And
Um,
is that like how is that how the system always works, or is it a theory that that's how the system is going to work, or is the system built in a way where if it happens to fall into those patterns, no matter what, that's going to be the end outcome?
The system since the creation of the central bank has worked that way. And in 1913, there was, for a couple of decades before 1913, there was this debate happening in the United States, because back before then, the United States was on more of a decentralized commercial banking standard. It was constitutionally only Congress can make money. They can like mint coins, and only gold and silver were legal tender. So that was the gold standard, and that's more of the Austrian school. So like I said, there's the Keynesian school and the Austrian school. And so before the central bank was created, the Federal Reserve, the United States was on this gold standard, and like the legal tender was gold, but you could issue paper currency and it was redeemable for gold at, I believe it was $20 an ounce. It was a pegged price. It was like if you
Okay.
had a $20 bill, you could go to the mint or the bank and get a coin, $20 worth of gold back for it. So this is more of an Austrian idea of like, if it's a commodity backed money or some kind of scarcity backed money system, then it's a cap on how much debt that politicians can print or can put the country into, because they can't just print the money. They have to issue the debt, and somebody has to buy the debt. And then because you're limited by the amount of people who want to buy the debt, then you don't have this massive inflation crisis that we currently see we've been going through. So in that world, yes, there are depressions in gold standards. There can be economic downturns, but it's more left up to the free market. And so the general idea for the Austrian school of thought is that if your money holds its value over time, so when you think about gold, it's the common sort of analogy that a lot of people make even today is, if you think about what $20 bought you back in 1925 versus what 1 ounce of gold bought you back in 1925, and you compare today, 1 ounce of gold could buy you probably a new car and maybe a couple of months rations for your horse, and I don't know, nice dinner, and take your spouse out on a dinner and buy a suit, something like that. I mean, back in the
I love
day,
how you said a new car and rations for your horse, and
yeah,
like,
because Because you had to have both a car and a horse in
Of
1920, right? You
course.
couldn't just have one.
I love
It's like
that.
having the electric vehicle and the gas vehicle now. You got to have both, right? You can't just go
That's why
all
they made
electric.
hybrids, right?
So whatever it was, like 1 ounce of gold, like was a pretty decent. At some
Mm-hmm.
points, it was buying you more. Sometimes it was less. Things used to cost a lot less back in the day because like they were meant to last and whatnot. But anyway, so the point is that an ounce of gold 100 years ago could buy you, let's say, let's just keep it simple, a nice suit and a nice date.
Mm-hmm. And a
Today,
horse.
you could, yeah, maybe like a sick horse. But today, an ounce of gold is now worth, I don't know, $5,000 Canadian. I don't know what it is exactly. It's continually been going up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a similar amount of stuff that an ounce of gold can buy you. But the $20 back in the day that could buy you the same stuff, $20 could, like, my grandparents built their entire house for like $500 in like the 30s or the 40s. I was talking to them about it recently. I was just blown away. My grandfather had to go to the bank and get a loan for $100. I was like, what the heck? So, now obviously $20 barely buys you a sub at Subway. I mean, that's the depreciation of the value of your savings over a fiat money system, which is a
Mm-hmm.
Keynesian sort of school of thought. And so the two different schools of thought are, well, if we have this way to print our way out of recessions and depressions and stimulate the economy by giving people money so they spend it, or giving companies money so they don't fail, or like with the mortgages and stuff like that they did in 2008, subsidizing and nationalizing
Mm-hmm.
some of those, preventing a lot of negative economic consequences. They try to control the economy and control the outcomes through pulling levers and printing money, interest rates, and different types of purchasing asset programs and printing money. And so your question is good because it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it has to be. It's just that's what the winners of that battle were: the Keynesians, the central
Mm-hmm.
bankers. So before that, there was it was very unpopular. People liked the idea of the decentralization of not having one central bank in control of everything, and there was risks to that too. Like, if you remember, have you ever watched the It's a Wonderful Life?
No.
There's this scene in there. It's like he runs a local savings bank, and there's a run on the bank, and everybody starts to try to pull their money out. But under this old banking system, and even still today somewhat, if you're like a savings and loan bank or like a credit union, it's not as much of a fictional reserve system as we currently have with the major banks. It's more of like a more collateralized reserve. And I'm kind of using weird terms here, so I'm trying to simplify it a little bit. But like, there's a general understanding that if you take $1,000 and you deposit it into the bank account, the bank has to keep some of that money, but then they can issue loans on it 10 times the amount. So $10,000 of new loans they can issue with your $1,000. Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of that's the have you heard of that concept before?
Yeah.
Fractional
Yeah.
reserve banking.
Yeah.
So people criticize that because before you know it, that turns into $100,000 because I take 1,000, I then deposit it, and then they loan 10,000 out to you. You take your 10,000 and then you deposit it, and that's that can turn into 9,000 more, whatever. It just, they can keep making that multiply. They call it the money multiplier, and that's how money in our modern fiat Keynesian banking system can grow and grow and grow with no cap, really. The only cap is the amount of demand that we as the citizens and businesses have to borrow more money. So it's funny, like, your demand, your signature for, like, I want to borrow this money to buy a house or whatever, is what creates new money, because the banks under this money system literally print money from nothing, the commercial banks. So in
And
the
is that
old
like a
days,
bad thing though? Like, does it have to be a bad thing? Because I think that's where it confuses me, is I'm like, okay, cool. Like, you have this power to do that. Sweet. does it have to be like a terrible end result if you take advantage of that?
So this is the key crux difference between the Austrian school and the Keynesian school, which is that if your money holds its value over time, you're going to be more reserved with your spending and your borrowing. You're going to be more conservative, and you're going to save more because
Mm-hmm.
your money holds its value. You can buy lots of horses with your money over time if you save it, right? But if you save in dollars, and we have this fictional reserve banking system where the central bank is printing money, the government is doing massive deficit spending, and the commercial banks are printing money from nothing based on demand. Before you know it, we have the world we're in right now, which is your dollar loses its value like significantly over a couple of decades. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have fractional reserve banking, and it's debatable whether or not it would work again if we went back to some sort of commodity-based Austrian style sound money system. It might work. It might not. It's kind of unsure. I mean, a lot of us believe it will work a lot better because it constrains
Mm-hmm.
politicians, because they need to go convince people to pay higher taxes or to borrow their debt, to buy their debt because they have to borrow to spend. The free market used to dictate the amount of spending the government could do. It's basically like what the taxpayers would bear would be the upper limit, because you don't
Mm-hmm.
want to be unpopular as a politician and get overthrown or whatever if you're charging too much taxes. But what they, there's a great book called Daylight Robbery that I recently read. That's just the history of taxation, and it all kind of like fell apart when they started implementing like deductions at source, because it's always unpopular to collect taxes. But just like during COVID, when they forced vaccine mandates and then they forced businesses to enforce vaccine mandates, it's hard for the individual consumer to have a voice, because you can say, well, I'm not going to that coffee shop because they have vaccine mandates. But that coffee shop owner is struggling. They're having a problem with like the COVID is just causing their customers to not come in. And then they are going to be fined $10,000 by the health authorities if they don't enforce
Mm-hmm.
vaccine mandates. So it's this coercive force that puts up a kind of a middle ground, a middle step there that kind of removes the stigma of enforcing negative things like vaccine
Mm-hmm.
mandates or taxes. So like a lot of us are aware that we pay crazy income taxes and general taxes in Canada, but because it's deducted at source, it's hard for people to see that, and it's hard for you to do anything about it, because like this is just the way the system works, right? If you're
Mm-hmm.
if you're getting paid a normal job, there's nothing you can do about it but be just depressed about it and kind of like frustrated and try to vote conservative or somebody that's going to lower your taxes.
Well, and even think too, like when you're shopping, when you're going out for dinner, like you just said, like deducted at source, the GST, HST, PST, depending on where you live. The climate one, they call it something different at every restaurant. And I'm like, what is Wendy's doing for climate change? Last I checked, nothing. Why are you taking an extra $2 off my bill? That's stupid. But like there's so many of those that you just don't even think about because it just happens. So again, it's like you're in this world that has like kind of been programmed the way that it has for a reason that you don't know and don't question because it's all you know. And you it's hard to find and understand any information about it and why it is the way that it is, which is why it is so confusing, which probably allows more corruption to happen and more people to do things that don't make any sense and that are certainly not in your benefit, and you would be none the wiser.
Yeah, and all through history, that's kind of what happens is
Isn't
countries,
that why Julius
politicians.
Caesar died?
I think there was something about one of the emperors that was he was coin clipping, and then he couldn't afford to
Yeah.
pay the soldiers anymore, and there was a revolt because the coins were being debased.
Huh. Anyway,
Yeah,
continue.
that's where the word salary comes from. Like salt was the currency for soldiers
Hmm.
back then guarding the salt mines. They get paid in salt, so it was their salary. We've used a lot of things as money through history. I've kind of discovered. Um, but just like you're saying that, these these things sort of, they're shiny objects that are like hold a lot of power and then attract the wrong types of people to grab onto them and then don't want to let go of that power. And then generally people are kind of like low information seeking. Like you can tell by the results of the election, like that's like low information voters was the problem. And, we're propagandized too heavily. So people thought that Mark Carney was going to stand up to Trump, and they were afraid of him because of the CBC and everything. So like it's like people, our human nature, unfortunately, I guess, is just kind of go with the flow, and we're deferential, and if we're told something, we kind of will believe it. And that this is globally, right? Like this problem with the money losing its value over time is like everybody's doing it, so that's what they always use as the excuse. Like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
well, we're not as bad as
Yeah.
Turkey, so everybody's doing it. Turkey's inflation rate was 18%. We were only 7 or 8. So what's the big deal? It's
It's
like,
like literally
okay,
arguing with a child. Like, but that's our government saying that to us. Like, well, it's not as bad as that guy. They did it first. Like,
yeah.
what is that? I wanted to ask a little bit more in depth because while I did utilize what you shared on a video that I posted about it, I have a better understanding, but I'm still kind of confused by it. So in the one thing that I talked about off the top here with CBC, where David Cochran was talking about how they used government bonds or something, they debted bonds or something, and so the Bank of Canada didn't actually print any money. Is that true? Yes or no? Is it semantics?
It's semantics, and actually, in his case, it was just blatantly false. What he was saying, it was just wrong on multiple levels. But generally, he's echoing this sort of semantic argument that the Bank of Canada and all the central banks are trying to take, which is, oh, we didn't really cause inflation because the bank reserves that we used to buy the bonds did not make their way into consumers' bank accounts, so they couldn't spend the bank reserves into the economy, so it wasn't inflationary. Like that's the general argument they're trying to make, and this is where it kind of gets so complicated that a lot of people's eyes glaze over, and it's difficult to really get it. And like I've spent hundreds of hours digging into this and trying to understand it myself, having conversations with people who've worked at the Federal Reserve and economists that have kind of written policy papers for banks, Bank of England and stuff like that. And the consensus is there is no consensus on how this whole system works. And it's kind of crazy once you really understand how they don't even know how much money there is in the world, so much so that they stopped reporting the numbers because it's just unknown. Like they use they separate it into these categories of M0, M1, M2, M3. This is how you'll see the stats if you look at like the Federal Reserve's St. Louis Fed website or the Bank of Canada Statistics Canada, whatever. You can actually go look at the balance sheet of the banks or the central banks and stuff, and it kind of like you can see how much of a certain type of money there is. And I guess you can think of these as like layers of money. So M0 is the monetary base, they call it. It's bank reserves and it's physical currency, notes and coins and stuff like that. And that's called the base money. And the really confusing thing is that like these bonds that are being bought in quantitative easing, when you've heard of that, right? Quantitative easing.
Yeah.
So quantitative easing is a new phenomenon in our money system. Like it's never really happened in modern history. And it's when they need to print so much money to do the Keynesian maneuver of stimulating the economy that there's not enough buyers for the government's bonds. Because in the past, for sure, the government has run deficits. I mean, and this is the thing, this is why it's so important that I wanted to talk to you specifically, to talk to your audience, because I myself I was kind of disillusioned by politics after I saw what they did to Ron Paul in the United States during his election. And I was like, man, this guy's making a lot of sense. He wants to end the wars. He wants to like audit the Federal Reserve and try to get us back onto some kind of sane money standard. He's warning about all this government debt. He's talking about libertarian principles like sound money and free speech and property rights. And it made a lot of sense what he was talking about, but they demonized him, called him a lunatic, and just made fun of him, didn't give him airtime, etc. So, and that was 2008 to 2012 when he was running. And it was around that time I started learning about this stuff a little more, because they were doing the bailouts. And back in, during the great financial crisis. And the bailouts
Of
was the
which Mark
first.
Carney saved us from, by the way.
Oh, yeah. He likes to take credit for that one, right?
Sorry.
So, like, that was the first time we'd ever tried that, like bailing out the government, or sorry, the banks and companies through quantitative easing. And so with quantitative easing, it really is just printing, like creating from nothing bank reserves, which are basically, you think about it like the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Canada. The Federal Reserve is the bank account for the Treasury. And it works pretty much the same way in Canada. We have this thing called Payments Canada that the dealers and the big banks like kind of like use this tool, but the Bank of Canada ultimately is the banker of the financial system in Canada and the government. So when the government issues bonds and issues the directive to print currency, it's done through, like in the Treasury in the United States, the Treasury tells the Federal Reserve to print the money. So the Congress in the United States, through passing laws, has delegated the monopoly of printing money and the not printing money, but like actually currency, the United States legal tender. They've delegated that to the Federal Reserve. So the Treasury is still the one that directs how much spending the government's going to do and how, issues bonds and things like that. And it's a similar system in Canada. And the reason why I'm saying this is because you got to wrap your mind around, it's not independent entities. Like, it's the way that the CBC and the left-wing media and liberals and stuff will try to like confuse you into thinking that they didn't inflate the money supply and they didn't print money, was they're using like semantic arguments to try to like take it out and look at it in a vacuum. Like, okay, we printed like the Bank of Canada printed bank reserves. They created bank reserves that didn't go into consumer bank accounts, so it didn't cause inflation. But that's what they'll try to say.
Yeah.
But you have to look at this as, in 1913 in the United States and in 1935 in Canada, we created central banks, and we gave central banks the authority to create money, M0 based money, the seeds of money. And that is used by commercial banks and dealers as reserves, as collateral in the bank lending markets and in borrowing and in lending to consumers and businesses. So they are able to it makes their balance sheets stronger so that they can lend more. Basically, it makes it so they can meet their capital reserve requirements and lending collateral ratios and liquidity coverage ratios and all of these different regulatory sort of suggestions of how they have to be capitalized and be safe and all this stuff. When they get issued this directive by the government and the central bank to, we're going to do QE, buy these bonds that we're going to issue, and we'll buy them from you with bank reserves. That's basically just monetizing government debt, and then allowing the banks to be sufficiently capitalized so that they can go make more loans, more mortgages, more credit cards, more student loans, more auto loans. So that situation all works together because the central bank, Wall Street, and the commercial banks, they all are it's this revolving door. Like, the regulators are the financial product creators and the bankers, and they go to the same cigar clubs or whatever. They go to the same colleges. Mark Carney was at Goldman Sachs and then Brookfield and the Bank of Canada and now Prime Minister. So the policymakers are the bankers, are the regulators. They're regulating themselves. And so there's this moral hazard with the way this Keynesian fiat central banking money system works, that it's like, are they truly putting your best interests as a citizen at heart here? Or are they trying to keep this party going and find themselves in a cushy job or an influential position or something in the next, phase of their career, and helping their friends and sort of like continuing this idea, pulling the wool over everybody's eyes, that, oh, we're not creating inflation, this is good for you. And then you get the political gaslighting from the leftists who are saying, we're going to help people by printing money because the cost of living is too expensive, so we're going to give you an inflation check, like rebate. And this is the biggest thing of all that kind of frustrates a lot of sound money advocates like myself. We realize that, like, you got to fix the money and then you'll fix the world. And
Yeah.
the more that you have this Keynesian fiat system that's just continual money printing and enabling commercial banks to just print money from nothing, and then banks or central banks to print bank reserves from nothing. It's the whole system as a whole that you have to take and see. The wealth gap is getting wider and wider, and it causes inflation. They literally target inflation. That's their mandate, to have inflation happen. They want prices to rise. And they believe the only way is that if they're in charge, pulling these levers, stimulating the economy, getting people spending, making prices slowly go up. And this causes people at the bottom to suffer the most, because who feels the price of the increase of a bag of milk the most, right? It's not Mark Carney. It's the single mom that's like unable to afford and just paycheck to paycheck. So this is the thing that like frustrates a lot of us, is it's not only the CBC is gaslighting and lying, but they're perpetrating a generational wealth gap. And it's just really frustrating, because we need to have honest conversations about this whole entire system. And even if, I was a huge Pierre supporter, I still am. Maybe not so much the advisors around him. I'm kind of still out on that one. Pierre, when you listen to him speak about the history of money, like, for somebody like me that's an advocate of Bitcoin and sound money, I listen to him speak about the history of money and how he understands how quantitative easing works, and dunking on the central bank when they were saying that the interest rates are low enough that they'll be able to keep making payments, it won't be any problems. And seeing how right he's been, it really makes me understand, okay, this guy gets it. Like, he understands this problem that we're talking about, that this inflationary monetary system, if you go too far with it, it's going to cause more suffering. And if you're just giving UBI checks out to people, you're actually continuing the inflation problem, and they're getting hurt no matter what, because the dollar is the problem. Like, it's purchasing power that you have to actually think about. You know what I mean? Like, going back to that gold idea.
I'm going to say something that's going to sound so dumb, but that's fine, because I genuinely don't know. And I'm like drawing things together in my brain, and maybe I misunderstood, and whatever. This is life. This is what I'm now calling Lane learned something.
Learn along with Lane.
So just help me out here as I get through this. So obviously, inflation happens when there's too much, right? Like, there's too much of this and not enough people here. Or is it when there's too many people who want to buy something and not enough things to buy, right? Essentially?
Well, there's two types of inflation. There's consumer price inflation, which you'll hear all the time. The CBC will say this, like, media outlets will quote the CPI, consumer price inflation. And then there's asset inflation. Asset inflation is stuff that wealthy people own, and desirable things that, like, all of us would like to have, like houses and assets like gold and Bitcoin and stocks or whatever it is. It's assets that's store of value vehicles, things that you are going to invest in. Like, they go up in value, and that's called asset inflation. So it's two sort of separate things, and they're caused by similar but slightly different things. You can have CPI, consumer price inflation. That's like goods, your rent, your cost of food, your cost of gas, your debt servicing payments, whatever it is. That's kind of consumer price inflation, a basket of goods that you need to live. And that's a government manipulated number. It's a political number. It's not a real number. And it's almost like polling, like how polling, it's this thing that, like, if they put out the polls to say that the liberals are going to win, well, then people are going to believe it, and maybe some conservative voters will stay home because the gap's too big, and it will embolden all these other people to talk about how they're going to win. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They do that with the inflation numbers, the CPI numbers. So when you see the CPI numbers, you got to realize, like, that's a political number. And the true inflation, it's like the basket of goods. If you were to calculate it yourself, some people do calculate it. There's the Chapwood Index and Shadow Stats. Those are like sort of alternative measurements of consumer price inflation. And it's like much higher than the official CPI numbers, because CPI is tied to certain things like fixed income bonds. So some bonds like that seniors are buying, or pension payments, or CRA salaries, or whatever, they're linked to CPI. So that's why you'll see a lot of government agencies go on strike to get a raise, because CPI rose, and they got to keep up with inflation. So they try to keep CPI as low as possible, because every time it goes up, after a little while, they have to actually pay the government employees more, or give more dollars to people that own these fixed income bonds and stuff like that. So, sorry, I kind of put another layer of concern onto your question, but to answer your question directly, though, you can have price inflation without excess money printing. So think about it like this: if there was $1 million total in the supply of money, right, and there was 1,000 people, and there was a fixed supply of coconuts, and everybody wanted a coconut, well, then the coconuts would cost pretty much like, supply and demand, free market, whatever. They would settle into some number. I don't know what it would be, but $50 or $100 or whatever. But if you keep the supply of money at $1 million, but then you add in 2,000 people, 1,000 more people come to the island, and now you have 2,000 people wanting the same amount of coconuts. The price is going to rise, because there's the same amount of money, more people, same amount of stuff. So you have two factors happening in Canada that cause our inflation crisis. There's the increase in the supply of money and the increase in the supply of people.
Okay, I'm actually so happy you said that, because that just like totally was, that was going to be my second question, which is funny. Because I was going to say that, it seems pretty clear to me at this point in time that one of the primary reasons why governments involve themselves in mass immigration, or immigration at unsustainable levels. I was reading that typically a sustainable level is 1% of the population, not 7.4, which is what it was under Justin Trudeau, or 5%, which is what Mark Carney recently said he was going to change it to. And by change it to, I mean keep it exactly where it is right now. But one of the primary reasons why governments will do things like that is to temporarily spike their GDP numbers. That seems to be pretty common around the world. And so I don't know if you're super familiar with that. I imagine you are, because you're a genius. So like, can you maybe kind of like explain that process, and then as well as explain the ripple effect of that in terms of people who are living somewhere where this is happening?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. I was looking at this recently, actually, because I was feeling very gaslit by CBC and these lefty Twitter guys when they were saying like, oh, these conservatives are so stupid, they don't understand how the money system works. I'm like, I have to dive deeper back into this, because it's been a few years since I literally looked at it, and I decided that I was going to stop diving so deep into the plumbing of the financial system, because when I got to the point where the people that I thought were the experts didn't know, and they were disagreeing with each other, I was like, what's the point of me trying to figure this out? I know where this is going, so I'm just going to buy more Bitcoin and try to convince as many people as possible to pay attention to this stuff, because I know where it's going. Like, the governments are never going to stop printing money. I don't really need to know what the reverse repo market does, and why the M3 money stats stopped being reported, and where did the bonds fit in the liquidity metrics and all this stuff, because it just is like a waste of time at a certain point. But I did go back into this in Canada because, one of the key things that the government did in 2022 and 2023 that really confused me was, after not reporting the budget for a little while, they came out with a budget and said, like, our GDP growth is huge. Like, we're doing so good. We're the best in the G8 or the G7 or whatever. And I'm like, what? Like, the debt is going haywire. The bank reserves are still way up. Like, they're not doing good. Like, our GDP is not doing good. Like, if you look at it on a long-term chart, and especially if you measure against like purchasing power, not dollars, because
I
our
always say
dollar
that to
lost its
people.
value.
It drives me crazy. People will be like, haha, Canada's economy isn't bad. Canada's economy is really great. And I'm like, what planet are you living on? When was the last time you went to the store and you bought something and you thought, this was really affordable? Like, every single time I
I
go grocery
know.
shopping, I'm like, oh, this is more expensive than it used to be. Crap. Like I'm like, what? Like,
Yeah,
how
but
can you say
they
that?
got it under control and the economy's doing good. I guess I'm just not sure what prices mean anymore. It's really
Yeah.
strange. But yeah, so you had this thing happen where with Freeland and Carney and Trudeau, like in this time period where we did massive QE for Canada. I mean, if you compare us to the United States, it was not that big. Like, the United States is almost $40 trillion in debt, right? So it's comparative though. We did huge measure normalize out for our GDP or for our per capita. We did massive, like Trudeau printed more money than any other prime minister, all the other prime ministers put together. Like, that's a stat
Which
that
is
was
just
popular.
crazy.
Yeah, and hired more federal employees with that money, because our federal employees, I think it took 150 years or however long it was from Confederation to, like, right before Trudeau was elected, to get the federal bureaucracy up to like 240,000 employees. And then in his terms, he printed more money than all the other prime ministers in Canada in history and hired more people than all the other prime ministers in Canadian history. 110,000 new people added. And that was one of the reasons how they were able to claim that our GDP was doing good. Increasing the immigration was another one. And also, so there's three things they did. And they increased immigration, they hired a ton of people and made it look like our jobs were going up a lot. And then they devalued the Canadian dollar through printing too much money. So when you there's a really good book called Currency Wars that was written like 15 years ago by James Rickards, and it's a great listen. Um, it's mostly about the currency war between China and the United States, which is probably more relevant to us in Canada than our, central banker prime minister. If you really look at the long arc of things,
Side
it's
note,
really.
did you hear that in China there's been like 5 banks that have closed? They've like gone bankrupt and like shut down
Yeah, I think it's 40 now.
with a
Yeah, I mean, there
zero?
was. Yeah, in 2009 to 2008 to 2012, there was, I think, 300 or some banks in the United States that went under.
Oh my gosh.
Like, when we started QE, what we did was we took the risk away from one part of the economy and of the financial system and put it on another part. So we no longer see a lot of bank failures. But what we see is people becoming poorer because your money loses its value. So the risk is now put onto the public in the currency. The risk is not like banks are going to fail and you're going to lose your money, and CDIC is going to need to come in and bail you out of your TD bank account. It's that the government's going to do more QE and your dollars are going to continue to lose their purchasing power, because they don't want to see panic in the streets. They don't want to see people doing runs on the banks and then saying, "What do you mean I can't get $4,000 out of the bank machine?" Like, what do you mean? Where's my money? And then they start to look like, "Oh, wait, there is no money. The money's not actually real. Like, you make the money from nothing. Like, why do we use this system?" They don't want
Yeah.
people looking behind the curtain, right? So with QE, they've kind of extended out the long times that it takes for people to understand what the hell is happening, and it shows up in inflation. So rather than a bunch of bank failures, we get a whole lot of inflation, and our currency becomes worth less and less on an international scale. So
Hmm.
that currency war situation, China and the United States have been doing this for 20 years or so. Um, all through history, this is a thing. Usually, what happens, there's a currency war, and then there's a trade war, and then there's a hot war, and that's kind of like we're at the trade war phase, and it's been a trade war for a while now, actually, like between the United States and China. Even Biden's administration did the CHIPS Act, which was basically like the opening volley in the trade war. And a lot of people think that the COVID lockdowns and the COVID supply chain disruptions were part of a trade war by China on the United States. So we're like 5 years into a trade war right now. A lot of people think, oh, Trump's tariffs are the trade war, the start of the trade war. Yeah, it's just like how Russia invading Ukraine was the start of the Ukraine-Russia war. It actually goes back to like way before that. Like the war was
Hmm.
Canada was fighting in Ukraine for like 10 years before that in a proxy war. So a lot of stuff is anyway. So the currency war situation is relevant because when the Liberal government chose to devalue the Canadian currency against the United States dollar by printing a lot of money and doing QE more than the United States was, bringing in tons of people, like you said, way over the normal amount of immigrants that would normally be let into a country. That created this temporary sort of stimulus of people getting mortgages, getting car loans to the tune of maybe 30, $40 billion of new money creation. So that because of the way that the central bank and the government regulate the banking system and give them a license to make money from nothing, and literally in Canada, it's even more centralized than the United States. In the United States, the Federal Reserve is somewhat independent. They are, like recently, Jerome Powell said that Trump can't fire him. Like Trump was trying to fire the governor of the central bank, the Fed chair, Jerome Powell. And somebody asked him, like, are you worried about that? And he's like, it's not legal. It's not allowable under our law. So in the United States, it's a sort of public private corporation system where the Wall Street banks and these regional banks all over the United States kind of form this Federal Reserve system. And they govern themselves. The president can elect people to the board, and then there's one person that the president can put up for a nomination to run the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve kind of has this independence. And so we kind of have a similar system here, but there's this other department that's basically run by the finance minister that regulates the banking system. And we literally have a rule in Canada where the cabinet can just override the Bank of Canada. So that's why there was one of Pierre's first famous clips that got him really popular online with people like myself and sound money circles was when he was asking Chrystia Freeland, how much have we spent in COVID time? Like, how much is the taxpayer on the hook for? And she would just go on with this rambling answer. We have to make sure we retain the independence of the central bank. It's not prudent to suggest that we're not independent. And he'd be like, just the number, please. And then she would go back with this long-winded answer of, it's not appropriate to say that the central bank should be, giving these numbers out. And he'd be like, that just the number, please. That went so viral in circles that I'm in because it was like, this is insane. They literally won't say how much money that they've spent. Like, Canada's a mess. So the Chrystia Freeland, as the finance minister, holds the shares to the Bank of Canada. It's like this symbolic thing where in the United States, it's all these banks, like hundreds of banks, hold the shares to the Federal Reserve System. So it's the bankers that kind of own the Federal Reserve System. And they're not tradable shares. Like a lot of people will say the Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. And like it's a private corporation. They're getting rich off the Federal Reserve. That's not really how it works. The real sinister way that it works is that, like I said earlier, it's a revolving door. They regulate themselves. They give themselves the ability to print money and charge you 20% interest on your credit card and give you overdraft fees when you go down negative in your bank account. And then what happens when they go negative in their bank account? The government bails them out to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars and puts the interest rate to zero. So they can afford it. But your interest rate goes up to 25% on your credit card and you get non-sufficient funds fees. The whole entire system is a scam stacked up against the average person to demoralize you and get you disillusioned. And it sounds so complicated that you won't even look into it. But that's what they did the cabinet, like the government, has way more power to control what the central bank in Canada does than in the United States. So when the government and the CBC try to say we didn't cause inflation, they literally give the money printing licenses to the banks to print the money, and they literally bring in all these people that are borrowing 20, 30 billion dollars that causes the inflation. So both the M0 money supply went up, which is the base money, and the M2 money supply went parabolic, and that's the broad money supply. And it's caused because of what you were kind of astutely referring to there, was their strategy of trying to pretend like our GDP is doing so good by bringing in a lot of people who are going to be buying things and borrowing money, which causes inflation and a little bit of GDP growth, and then injecting an epinephrine pen into our economy through deficit spending and lowering interest rates and devaluing our currency, which hurts people who save in dollars, and it hurts the bottom 50% who are the most vulnerable on the poverty line. And it attracts temporarily investors from other countries that say, "Oh, look at I can invest in Canada now. It's 25% cheaper." And so in a way, what they did was a slap in the face of the United States, because the United States is trying to onshore all this, they're trying to reform their economy, reshore and everything. And Canada, their neighbors over here, saying, "Hey, we're going to lower our currency 25%. Just come over here and invest." Well, what's that going to cause? It's going to cause animosity. And not only that, but then they come out and start saying, "We're the best performing country in the G7. We're way better than the United States." Well, what do you think is going to happen when you get somebody like Trump in office? Like, "Oh, you lowered your currency 25%. Here's a 25% tariff." It's no longer more competitive for our investors to go to Canada. So we're just going to fix that currency volley that you just did. So they did a lot of things wrong, and mostly what ends up happening
like malicious.
Yes.
Intentionally. Yeah. And that's kind of the thing. It's like, at the end of the day, I've always been right leaning for sure. I honestly still today would probably consider myself to be like a traditional libertarian, but that means, right wing extremist in 2025. So, but it's one of the reasons why, like, I could never actually cross the floor, is because the more you research into this, the more little details you start to understand and get a grip of. It's just like, no, there's actually been so many things that have like really hurt us on the global scale that have made, like, if I was Trump, I don't think I'd like Canada very much right now after, all the years of being like mean to me behind my back, like I'm like gross, like I would hate all of that. And then you think about that as well. And that's something I've never once ever considered. So that's very interesting. Do you speculate that there's likely some motivation perhaps behind that? Or is that just kind of like a theory?
Well, I initially, when it was happening and they were claiming that our GDP was so good and stuff, and they were printing all this money, and in the face of the United States doing aggressive quantitative tightening, which is the opposite of the quantitative easing, where they monetize government debt. Quantitative tightening is where they like reduce the size of the central bank's balance sheet to the point where like they let the bonds roll off and get, try to let them be purchased by the free market instead of the central bank. And Canada started to do that, but not to the level of the United States. And we didn't aggressively lower or raise our interest rates as much as the United States. The whole point of that was to try to stop inflation. The United States was doing quantitative tightening and raised interest rates from this artificially low zero bound that is historically, the only other time I think we've done that in modern history is like World War II. So it's emergency, kind of like out of the norm for interest rates to be that low, because what that causes people to borrow. If your interest rate's low, they can monetize government deficit spending, but then they can also cause the citizens to borrow too much because they think, I can carry more debt because they're going to keep the interest rates low. And then you bring immigrants in and like, they're like, "Oh, it's 0% interest here," or it's like 2% interest where it was 10 or 15% where they're from. They're like, "I'm going to borrow a whole bunch of money too. It's so cheap to borrow money in Canada." So the United States recognized this was causing a generational inflation crisis, and they acted aggressive to try to crush assets and to try to make it really hard and expensive to borrow money, or harder, more expensive to borrow money, to sort of temper people's borrowing, which temporarily caused, actually over 3 years, it caused a drop in the broad money supply of M2, which is the money in everybody's bank accounts and like mutual, money market funds. Like if you buy like a GIC or something like that, it's cash and cash like instruments. So things that can be easily converted into money. So maybe it's not dollars in your bank account, but it could be a mutual fund or something like that. They count all that as like the broad money supply. It's all the money the banks create from nothing when you borrow loans and stuff like that. In the United States, it went down, right? And as I said, like during that time period, we started bringing in like way more immigrants than we normally should. And we didn't raise our interest rates as fast. So that caused this spike of the M2 money supply, which devalued our currency against the United States. And so when they were coming out with all these policies that seemed just kind of inept, honestly, I was like, and it's very easy to criticize and say, Chrystia Freeland's a journalist. She doesn't know what she's doing. Trudeau, he was a drama teacher. He didn't, he said the budget will balance itself, and kind of look at it as the surface as like, oh, well, these guys are kind of like clowns in a way. And so like, of course they're dumb. They don't understand money. Like they're just going to be trying to spend. But the deeper I looked into it, the more I realized they had somebody like Mark Carney in the background in a premeditated fashion, understanding what was happening and understanding if I pull this lever, it will counteract here. And if I pull this lever, it will drop the currency just enough to bring an investment in. And if I bring more immigrants in and keep the interest rates lower than the United States, we're more competitive, people will borrow, it'll be a political win for us because we can go out on CBC and claim best G7 country in the world, our currency's attracting new investors and our GDP's doing good, like with it being like not really like a blatant lie, because if you look at it just in that narrow band of
Yeah.
that time frame,
It's like that cherry picked. And then also
yes.
too, it's cherry picked, and then you also, I think, have very, very clear knowledge that the majority of your population will probably fall for that. Like that's why I'm like, it's so convoluted, and I want to feel like it isn't. I want to believe that it's not just filled with corruption, and it's not something that just by all accounts is very evil. I want to believe that. But the more I dig into it, the more I'm like, oh wow, okay. Like it comes to a point where you kind of have to like look at yourself in the mirror and be like, okay, no, like this is actually what we're dealing with. And the problem is that most people don't know that, right? And it's hard to explain to them. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes them feel good to support the liberal government as a whole. And so, I'm liberal because I'm a good person, and I'm a good person because I'm liberal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there is something that seems like just very nefarious, very, very planned, and very well thought out in terms of like our demise almost. And it's really bizarre to kind of feel like a pawn in this game almost.
It's very demoralizing and frustrating for you. And like I was in those shoes back before I discovered Bitcoin. And that's why I think like I'm so glad that you're having me come on and talk about these things, because I've been like sitting there like cheering on Pierre, and he got Bitcoin. I don't know if you remember, but early
Yeah.
in the campaign before he was leader, he was kind of like hanging out with friends of mine and like, going to
Oh, and
Tahiti's and
people
buying.
roasted the hell out of him for that too.
They did, yeah. And that was the unfortunate thing. Like he got Bitcoin and he really understood the value of it as the future of money. And he's a freedom of choice guy, right? So he was just kind of like letting people like supporting people who are exercising their right to choose the money that they want to use.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, he was way right. I mean, he was advocating for Bitcoin when Bitcoin was like $30,000. He brought the CEO of Tahini's into the House of Commons to have a discussion about how like it might be smart for the Bank of Canada to purchase Bitcoin, to have a national Bitcoin treasury.
That's also
And
like
this
such
was
a ballsy move. Like I like
yeah.
that. I actually like I know like I don't You've explained it to me, so I definitely understand it a lot better than I once did. And I'm going to continue to learn more, obviously. But, like to do something like that, which at the time, especially, was so niche, is just like, that's like a really, it's like, oh, like you're actually like really, you're kind of outside of the box. You're thinking outside of the system, and it's a creative, ballsy idea to bring into such a, I don't know, such a regulated place, right? Where like that's not even on the table anywhere. So I'm just like, I like that. Whether or not it's a great idea is up to, whatever it is that you personally believe about it, I suppose, or where the facts lead you in it, depending on where you research and what you know. But like at the end of the day, I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. I like that. That's a good spirit.
Well, yeah, it was great, and it signaled to a lot of us that are kind of in the know about these issues that this guy, we should put our weight behind him because he understands this stuff. And Bitcoin is not just, a lot of people think of it as like it's a get rich quick scheme or it's an investment or something like that, but really, like, Bitcoin is a political movement, and it's a free speech sort of activist movement in a lot of ways, that goes back to the cryptography wars in the 90s when the government was literally trying to stop people from having cryptography. And if they were successful in that, we would not have Signal and we would not have Telegram. We would not have the end-to-end encryption because the government wanted that to become like a national defense, sort of thing, that they just didn't want people to be able to use encryption technology. And Bitcoin is built on that encryption technology. And it was created by this anonymous person, Satoshi Nakamoto, who was a cypherpunk, who was in these conversations when this group was trying to protect free speech and against censorship. So Bitcoin is like free speech technology mixed with sound money, using digital gold. It's an innovative technology. It's the future of money for the age of the internet. But it's also like a political thing because, and this is where like I feel less like you feel right now because I'm into Bitcoin and I vote with my fiat, which is the phrase that we use. And fiat, we talked about that earlier. Fiat, it just means by decree. It's money by decree. It's not a money because it has intrinsic value or it has certain properties that make it a good store of value. It's money because we say so. That's kind of like the Keynesian sort of monetary system we live in. Dollars are fiat, basically. So, gold is not fiat. Gold is a sound money. Bitcoin is a sound money. So, with Bitcoin, you can kind of opt out of these political games and not have it become your identity, like you're at top of your identity stack. And it would suck a lot more for me. Like I was disappointed and really frustrated when Pierre wasn't able to win. And but I was able to move on from that pretty quickly to like, okay, how can I be productive and how can I help as many people as possible protect themselves against what's coming? Because with Mark Carney, the reason why so many of us Bitcoin people got so active to support Pierre and try to get behind the conservative movement was because we can see where this is going. We're students of monetary history. We understand the pitfalls of unchecked government spending and inflationary monetary policy. And it leads to more censorship, more, CBDCs is something that people are sort of vaguely aware of as something we don't want. And, there's a lot of confusion out there. People think CBDC, Bitcoin, it's all digital. Therefore, Bitcoin must be bad because it's digital like a CBDC. So there's a lot of misconceptions about Bitcoin. And, obviously there's a lot of people that are just feeling like, what the hell, why would I want to even think about Bitcoin? So I get it. Like there's a lot of people that just, it's just like, that's an investment. Like I'm paycheck to paycheck. I can't afford to feed myself. I'm trying to I'm going to the food bank. Why would I even think about investing in a Bitcoin? So I totally understand. It's like the situation we're in is really bad. But the thing is that if you understand the benefit of saving money, all you have to think about is Bitcoin is a savings technology. And if you don't like digital and you want to choose gold, you can choose that too. It'll at least in 100 years, you'll be able to buy a horse with your gold. But with Bitcoin, you'll be able to buy the stable and the whole company that owns the horses. the unicorns, you'll be able to buy whatever in 100 years.
You were talking about Canada and the things that they were doing that were like shitty. I don't really know how else to put that in terms of inflating our numbers and all of that, and how at certain points in time when you do that, it can attract investment. But I'm curious for you. Obviously, our investment, at least according to the Nanos poll, there was a Nanos something poll that came out a while ago. Perhaps you saw it. I just talked about it on my show yesterday, showing that investment in Canada is at like an all-time low right now. It's like since it's been recorded, it's like some of the lowest it's ever been. And do you think that the Liberal government did all these fancy little tricks? They had all these cherry-picked data points so they could say certain things to make us look a lot better than we were, which is just evil, by the way. Omitting, lying by omission is still a lie, and I don't like that. Do you think that even if, because we have Mark Carney now, and if he were to try to do some of the similar tricks, which we can imagine he will, because we're going to build the best economy ever on my theory of what the best economy ever is that I wrote about in my book, that's been implemented in other parts of the world and has failed miserably, and has partially been implemented in Canada and has failed catastrophically, but we're going to keep doing it and it's going to work this time. Stupid. But do you think that if there's more of those tricks pulled, that Canada as a whole could see more periods of time where there are, high rates of investment, where the economy is perhaps a little bit better again? Or do you think that like a lot of other people have kind of caught on to the tricks that Canada has been pulling under this government in particular, and that it was almost like it worked for the time being, but it's probably not going to work again?
Well, I'm not a trained expert on these subjects. I've just consume a lot and think a lot, and I could be wrong. And I use, Chat GPT sometimes, but at least I use the pro model, which has got better. it's not AI slop as much as the free model. But when I could have been wrong on that, but when I ran the numbers a year and a half ago or a year ago or whatever it was, I thought I saw that there was an uptick temporarily that coincided with their timing of saying that we were the best in the G20, with the depreciation of the currency that showed a similar uptick in imports in that year, exports to the United States. So that's not, when you zoom out in the long arc of things, yes, we still have this structural problem where many people that I think are correct say that we've lost $500 billion of investment over the last 10 years because of the net zero sort of climate activism stuff, and just generally high taxes and uncompetitiveness, and poorly produced TV shows on our mainstream news channel or whatever. It's causing all this malinvestment and bad investment. But I know personally there's a project that was a offshore port project on the East Coast that they tried to do all the climate sort of disclosure, green, activating
The climate alarmism checklist.
Activating the green money, whatever that is, the carbon, the carbon money coming in from Europe,
the carbon regulations. I know what you mean, and I'm sure everybody else does too. Don't worry.
They made it the most attractive. These are like conservative people too, but they're like, we just want to build this project. We want more jobs in Nova Scotia. Mm-hmm. So we're going to make it as green as possible. We're going to do all the stuff. We're going to do all the things. And they had, I think it was even former Prime Minister John Chrétien was like an advisor for the project. Like they really went into let's get this done mode, right? And it was going to be offshore wind farming and hydrogen and all this stuff that Europe wanted. And in the end, like multiple billions of dollars was just like they walked away from it, these investors that wanted to come in, because there was too much policy risk to invest in Canada.
I
even
think
if you
that's
were
one of the
going to tick all the
biggest
boxes.
ones. Yeah, that's one of the biggest ones is the policy changes and all like it's so and I've talked about this in shows before too. Like it's such a bad state of affairs what has been created in Canada where it's like even if we can do it and it could be profitable, policies here are changing all the time about these weird little ideological things that like
Hmm.
we just don't have to deal with that anywhere else. Why would we deal with like why would we go through the process,
Yeah.
be 5 years into a project, oh now something changed again because we've decided that I don't even know. Now something changed again because we've decided that, you know, we want to tax you capital gains all of a sudden on this thing now.
Yeah,
And
unrealized capital gains. And
like just like dumb stuff like that. And then
yeah,
it's like, well, why would we do that?
I don't think that we're going to see that trend change, because unless Carney really does change his mind on where he's going to take Canada, and it's not his kind of TCFD climate disclosure net zero stuff that he's known for when he was like financializing climate disclosures and then making policy changes and investing in the companies that would be benefiting from these policy changes in carbon markets and all that stuff. Like that's what his role was at Brookfield. He was a deal maker, and Pierre's called him a political grifter and stuff like that, which is probably fair in some
Yeah.
ways. Obviously, he's a smart guy. Like he's held a lot of positions, but he's a Keynesian, and he believes that he can target inflation, and he's smarter than the free market. And that's what Keynesians believe. They believe that they're smarter than the free market and that they need to install all these levers. Or there's a climate lever, there's an interest rate lever, there's a QE lever, there's a collateralization reserve lever, and they just keep pulling all these levers and they just keep making the problem worse. And then the system blows up in some way, and then they install another lever and pull that. And before you know it, it's like there's policy risk, there's inflation crisis, there's homeless crisis, there's a generational kind of like disillusionment crisis for young people, entrepreneurship crisis. So this it seems, I don't know what you feel, Jasmin, but like he's announced over the last week or so some things that I feel as like, oh my god, at least it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Like he said he was going to have the by-election called as soon as possible so Pierre could get
Mm-hmm.
back in the House. He started stealing more of Pierre's policies, which honestly, like at this point, let's just take a win. If we can
Yeah.
get inflation down, if we can get the cost of homes down, if we get the crime down, if he's going to take that stuff on and get the fentanyl crisis under control, I would have liked if Pierre got all the credit for that, because he's basically just taking Pierre's policies, and he's claiming he's not going to do an NDP majority sort of finagling thing. So it seems like he's actually. I'm not as scared. I'll just put it that way. Like I was like, shit, I got to leave Canada. Like this is not a safe country to be in if we're going to be kind of like going towards this Privy Council report, eating cats under bridges and stuff. Like I don't want to be in a country like that. So if he continues in this way, and the other thing about this, which again is kind of like, we'll see how it plays out, but there's probably going to be a lot of people that voted for him that really were the elbows up type, and they actually
Yeah.
believed that, and they're now probably going to be like, what the hell is he doing? Like, I'm for net zero, and I'm for more free drugs at the drug dens. Like, I'm not for stopping crime and all this stuff. So he's probably like, we'll see. I think it's going to be a hard battle, but in general, it's still really risky to be an entrepreneur in Canada, and especially if you're going to come from another country. Like, it's so much
Mm-hmm.
more interesting to go to America, like especially if Trump starts to do super competitive stuff, like gets rid of income tax for anybody under 100K, or lowers capital gains taxes, and some of these things that Pierre was going to do, which would have been a lot more business friendly.
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot too, and I've had like I chat with like I'd say just about every single person that's in this space in Canada because there's not a lot of us. And I talk with almost all of them. I got a phone call from two of them while I was filming this with you, and I had to mute them. Like, so like a lot of us like we do chat a lot, and I would say, as far as I can tell, and I've had this conversation with quite a few people at this point in time, I agree with you that there have been some things that he's done that have been surprising to me. Um, I think that I'm going to continue feeling really uneasy and kind of scared until probably mid-October, roughly, because how I think things are right now, and I'll give credit where credit is due. Him announcing that he was going to call that by-election for Polyev right away, as long as he follows through with that, that's great. That's the moral right thing to do, and I'll give you credit. I don't care that you're Mark Carney. That was a good decision to make, and it was a kind decision to make. Um, but like there's been a lot of other things that he's been saying and claiming that I it's so polar opposite from who he has been his entire life as far as it is recorded that we can find access to and read and study. And it's
Mm-hmm.
also so polar opposite from what he campaigned on that I have a really, really hard time believing that Canada's going to be an economic superpower stronger than we were after World War II at all under him. Like I have a very hard time believing that. I do think there's been a couple of interesting things that have happened though. One predominantly being Danielle Smith and the Alberta referendum talks. It does appear that you've had other premiers now speaking out on behalf of Alberta, criticizing the federal government on behalf of Alberta. Everybody's doing that obviously because they're waving their flags, because everybody knows that as much as they want to deny it, Canada as a whole would be in a very dire situation if it were not for the money of Alberta. The problem, though, is what are we going to do to expand that? And not just in Alberta. Saskatchewan has a lot of resources, too, that we can be utilizing. So does Manitoba. A lot of those things, though, as well, it's provincial jurisdiction. And so they're canceled, or there's other things in there. But like it all comes down from the top at the end of the day. So I think there's a lot of unknowns that still have me feeling quite worried. So for me, I'm really keeping an eye on what happens during that period of time. Let's also factor in that we haven't had a functioning government since, like last September. So
Crazy.
it's pretty not cool. I think
Like,
with
why do
Mark
we
Carney
need
though.
to? Well, the government
Oh,
hasn't been doing shit. Like, why do we need to pay so much money as taxpayers for this government if we can go basically a whole year without them doing anything?
mm-hmm.
It's ridiculous. Why do we have to pay such high
Yeah.
taxes?
Well, you know what? I think it'd be so different. Maybe there could be a conversation for all of that stuff if Canada was in far better shape. But like when there are so many problems that we
Right.
have that can actually very easily be fixed. Like I posted about this today. Even like Donald Trump in 16 weeks, less than 16 weeks, signed a deal with the UK. Nothing crazy, like it wasn't anything crazy extravagant to the tune of trillions of dollars or anything like that, but it was something.
Politics, getting active and voting and encouraging people to vote towards dodging the iceberg is a little bit like takes precedence. So that's kind of what the situation I've been in. And so I don't really follow politics a lot. And I find it's like so hard to talk about it online, especially with Facebook people and stuff, because you get so angry and then there's drama. And so I'm just like, man, I want to know as little as possible about global politics. I just
Why
want
are we
people.
friends then?
Well, it's like, I really appreciated your voice during this whole time, and like people like there's a bunch of people that I was really like I'd love seeing them come up onto my feed, and I had my
Hmm.
algorithms tuned in a way that I wasn't seeing any of this like crazy, five needles in the name people like saying Pierre is a Hitler and all this stuff. I wasn't seeing any of that. I was seeing like you and funny stuff from Pleb and Kyle Kemper and uh, Blender News and just all of these independent voices, Rupa and
Hmm.
Karya or whatever her name is, Karya I think. A bunch of these independent voices were just like, okay, like there's hope here that we have a thriving independent voices here that are fighting for the things that like even though I'm not into politics, you're not into Bitcoin. We have this similar respect for the things that are like in the sort of libertarians area, I
Hmm.
guess, free speech, sound money, property rights, like individual responsibilities, individual liberties, these things. So for me, it was like, I'm thankful for you and for everybody else that was doing this because it made it easier. to go through, and I feel bad for you guys, really. So I'm like, I want to help as much as I can, because if this free speech shit comes through, like if they really start
That's what I
cracking
was
down,
gonna. That's like one of my greatest fears at the moment, without a doubt. Like that's something I'm thinking
it's
about like crazy, and I'm like, hey, do I move? Do I start? Do I like? I have
well,
friends who live in the States. Do I start uploading my like I'll send my content to them, and they can upload it from the States, and then I'll be safe. Like I'm like, how do we? It's just crazy.
it's and even me as a Bitcoiner, like I'm very critical of central bankers. I think
Mm-hmm.
they are the culprit of the inflation crisis, and they're causing homelessness, food insecurity, the wealth gap. Like they are directly causing suffering here. And like I'm not shy about being upset that, certain people in our government are stupid and and causing a lot of problems. So, I'm with you. Like I feel a little bit vulnerable here as well. And I just hope that it doesn't get as bad as it is in Europe right now, or worse. But that topic of censorship is one of the reasons why I want to come on to like podcasts like yours and try to help you even off air. Like censorship is the reason why Bitcoiners are so active in online trying to help people, because
Mm-hmm.
here in Canada and the United States, so we have monetary privilege, really. Like we have a globally sort of respected currency in some regards. I mean, Canada, not as much these days, but most countries in the world are like under severe inflation or capital
Mm-hmm.
controls or literal like wealth confiscation. Just billions of people in the world do not have the types of currencies that we are lucky enough to have. Like even though we've had crazy housing inflation and stuff like that, so Bitcoin for billions of people in the world is like that tool that they can use. That's like the internet. It's the first time they're able to communicate with somebody outside of the regime, or they're
Mm-hmm.
now able to have money in a way that's theirs, so that they can take with them wherever they go, and that can't be confiscated or censored. So Bitcoin is like your savings account that the government and the banks are not involved in it at all with you. And so like for that free speech aspect and that censorship aspect, not only all the stuff we talked about during the show about like the history of money and how dollars are fiat, and we live in this Keynesian central bank system where your purchasing power is eroded all through time, which Pierre talks about a lot, which is why he advocates for less spending. But then you also have this free speech issue, which is like it's free speech money, and it's censorship resistant money. So you can take it with you, you can store it in your brain, you can cross the border, and that's going to be more important for people who are activists and free speech sort of like maximalists in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
If this stuff with Mark Carney goes to the point where we're afraid of, it's going to be even more important for you to protect yourself and your money with Bitcoin. So that's what I'm trying to contribute here in some small way, to like nudge people towards understanding how important this is going to be for us, like it is for people in Lebanon and Nigeria
Mm-hmm.
and Kenya and all these places where I'm, have friends that are like really need Bitcoin.
Okay, well, I had another question for you, but I'm not going to ask it. I will instead have you on another time to get deeper into it, if you're fine with that.
I'm down. Yeah, let's do this again. Thanks a lot for chatting with me.